All right, today we are looking at women and World War One. So what I want to look at first is kind of actually what happened before the war, because the U.S. When the war, World War One started, um, the U.S. attempted to maintain neutrality and tried to claim that they were impartial, but we really weren't, because ultimately we were closer allies to Britain, and of course then you had immigrants that were, first generation Americans, as well as those that had just come over recently that had connections to Europe. So, and then trade and everything else. We just had too many connections to Europe to be fully neutral and impartial. But that's certainly the stance that the U.S. took, along with the idea that. They actually took an anti-war mentality. Is that the isolationist view? Europe's over there; it's really far away. That's Europe's problem, not the U.S.'s problem. And we'll do that again in World War II as well. It was easier to do here because, right, planes are just starting, and there weren't passenger planes, and so you wanted to get to Europe, you took a boat that took months to get you there. So it did seem far away, right? The world gets a lot smaller when people can hop on planes and travel over within hours of time versus months of time to get over there. So it makes sense why there felt like there was this significant enough of a divide to where we could say European stuff is not our problem. And so because of this, women actively took a role in anti-war protests in a variety of ways. And they were some of the most outspoken anti-war protesters. There were men who were protesting against the war or spoke out against the war, but women by far were some of the most active protesters, in part because they connected it to the loss of husbands and sons, and the devastation that war brings to the families. One of the biggest organizations that was created was the Women's Peace Party, or WPP. And this group had over 20,000 members, which is significant when you look at the shift that's going to take place from anti-war to pro-war sentiment. And what the Women's Peace Party said that their kind of goals was to be dedicated to resolving conflict in Europe, based on the idea, of course, that there had to be a better way to resolve conflict than war, and specifically through peaceful negotiation and conversations. Right, that this was what should be the goal of nations to do, rather than go use war. Women marched and protested against the war. They held many rallies to talk, and they had speakers that came and talked about the evils of warfare and the cost. And were actively involved in writing literature, newspapers, and things like that in the protests. You also had within that the Women's Peace Party was involved with was the Women's International League. This is a long name, for Peace and Freedom. This was a group that was set up, and it was they met in the Netherlands. So you had 47 women from the WPP that traveled by boat, right? So they took out months there and months back of their time to attend this conference, to discuss basically how to resolve conflict without war. And then, of course, just discuss the impact of war. So discussed impact of war, I'll say, and how they could help resolve conflict without war. And of course, just getting together to discuss as mothers and wives the impact that war has on them in the process. And participants came from all around the world to do this. It was largely, of course, you have women that were upper middle class to wealthy, because you have to spend multiple months being able to make the trip, plus it's expensive. Like paying for a trip on a boat to Europe was not cheap. And so while largely, we'll say, middle to upper class, you did have some working women that also joined as well, which was significant because oftentimes the working class was excluded from these type of things, not like by policy, but just by the sheer fact that they couldn't afford to do so. They agreed to meet again after the war to continue pushing for better alternatives to warfare. And then Jane Addams, who was the founder of the Hull House, she actually was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for her role in getting this set up, which was a big deal for a woman to be given this prize. And this was in 1931 that she got it for, let's say, her role in the conference. So you have this organized system of women that were very active in protesting the war and felt very passionately about it. And again, with 20,000 members within the WPP, it showcased how important that sentiment was to women. However, what starts to happen is you're going to end up with conflict of anti-war protesters because the U.S. is going to get involved in the war. And we'll talk just really briefly about what led to that in just a minute. But once the U.S. gets involved in the war, right, the anti-war sentiment was fine when the U.S. was still claiming neutrality, right? But once the U.S. was involved in the war, then anti-war sentiment, we'll say protests, were seen as unpatriotic, right? So there was one of the things that happens, you don't have this in World War II as much just because of the nature of the war and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, so there was less anti-war sentiment because the U.S. was attacked. But at this point in time, there very much was this idea that it was either or, that you were either, if the U.S. was involved in a war, then you needed to support that. If you didn't support the war, then you were against the U.S. There was no middle gray area of saying, I support the United States, but I think war is wrong, right? That middle ground was not allowed. You were either for the U.S. by supporting the war, or you were against the U.S. by protesting the war. and it was a hard switch because you had a couple of years of the war where it was lots of anti-war protests, and then all of a sudden we get involved. And you have to then have this immediate shift from going to protesting the evils of war to now being like, oh yeah, go war. And that became difficult. And many women, whoa, I think that's the first time that's made that weird mark with it. Many women did switch to supporting the war. You did have others that continued to speak out. Others continued to speak out and protest, and doing so knowing that there was a risk to their jobs and freedom. Because it wasn't just, well, you're unpatriotic, boo you. There were actual consequences for continuing to be a loud anti-war protester. So examples of that, we have one woman, her name was Emily Balk, and she was an economics professor. And what she generally protested about was that the government, she will say, protested the government's right to draft men into war. And because she continued to do this publicly and loudly, she ends up losing her job. So she lost her job. Ida B. Wells, she spoke up against, she spoke up to defend the black soldiers that were being tried and then eventually convicted for the Texas insurrection. And the thing with this was that there was a ton of not only segregation that was still taking place at this time, but racism and attacks, and they were attacked, and this led to a large-scale fight. And many, her argument was that one, they shouldn't be tried, and eventually they were executed for treason. That this wasn't about treason. This was about racial inequality and being physically attacked. And that her other argument was that, of course, that who they were charging, not all of the men were active participants as well. And so she was threatened with jail for speaking out. And then one more example of actual jail time was Kate O'Hare. And she was sentenced to 5 years in jail simply for voicing sentiments against mothers being forced to sacrifice their sons. So she basically just voiced concern and dislike of the cost of war, right? Specifically with the idea of, because of warfare and soldiers being drafted, mothers were forced to sacrifice their sons. So the other thing was that there wasn't a standard of punishments, right? like, if you do this type of anti-war sentiment, this is the consequence. If you do this type of thing, it's this. You know, she got 5 years in jail, sentenced to 5 years in jail for saying that war was bad because women lost their sons. Right, and others lost their job. That was the more extreme case. There were lots of other women that were arrested and spent several months in jail for continuing to do marches, continuing to protest with signs. So there were women who continued that anti-war sentiment. And they often did so knowing that it risked, loss of job or freedom if they continued to do so. So how we got into the war, we'll put here, I say U.S. Involvement into the war. Yeah. Okay. So we started off as neutral. But neutrality, here we'll put that first, right? Neutral was our first phase, but then there were two main events that got the United States into war. And then this is going to lead to that shift that takes place where we just talked about and how that impacted women that had been anti-war protesters and the ones that continued to be. It didn't go well for them. The Lusitania was one of the first events. This was a British liner, but it was a passenger liner. So it was a passenger ship. It had the British flag, but it was taking off from New York. And one of the things that the Germans had in the war were U-boats, which were the earliest submarines. And they actually put out a newspaper ad that warned people, don't go on the Lusitania. If we see it, we'll sink it. So, I mean, they did warn people. You know, only one person canceled their ticket based on this event. There were 197 Americans on board. Now, the captain had been instructed to do a zigzag path. And the reason for this is that the U-boats were, like I said, the early submarines. And so they were just starting out as far as technology and what they and capabilities that they could do. So one of the easiest ways to avoid being shot down, essentially, or not really down, you're on the water, sunk, was to do a zigzag path. It was harder for the submarines to target. They really needed a straight line and a not super fast moving target. But the submarines, as much as it was like, well, can you just wait right there while we shoot you and just keep in a straight line, go slow, and then we'll be good? It still was this scary thing because this technology hadn't been around before, and now you have all these underwater boats that were potentially lurking in the water that you couldn't see, and you don't have sonar detection that's like the sophisticated sonar detection that we now have that can detect this stuff. And so it really did feel like this kind of, it was definitely the psychological fear as well. I mean, they were effective. They sunk quite a lot of ships. But there was a very easy way to often avoid it, which was simply to do a significant zigzag pattern to make it. That didn't mean that they still couldn't end up getting lucky and hit you, but it was a lot harder. He ignored that. So the captain, he ignored this and just went in a nice straight line. And so the ship's name was the Lusitania. Well, a German U-boat found them and shot them down. And from this, 128 Americans died. Over 1,000 passengers total died. and 128 of the Americans died in this. This caused a lot of furor with the U.S. And I'm sure the Germans were like, crap, we should not have done that, because the Germans didn't want the United States to come into the war. It was much better if they didn't. Well, ultimately what happens is that the Germans offer an apology, reparations, which was money for the families, and initially the Sussex Pledge. And what the Sussex Pledge was that submarines, their U-boats, I guess technically at this point, same thing, but the U-boats would warn passenger and merchant ships before shooting them down. And what they mean by that is that they would come up and show themselves, and then they would say that we're going to shoot you, and they would give them an opportunity to have all the passengers get off on lifeboats before they sunk the ship. So it wasn't that they couldn't sink the ship, it was that we're going to give you an opportunity to, look, we've got you in our sights, so you can either stay or you can abandon ship before we sink the ship. This lasted for a little bit, but the reality was is that what the Germans, where they were effective in the U-boats, was keeping a blockade against the British. And if they continued to honor this, not only could the British just use passenger ships and merchant ships to transport military goods and equipment, but it made it harder to maintain the blockade, and so they eventually broke the Sussex Pledge. So it was not just the Lusitania that was part of the issue that caused the U.S. to move closer to being involved in the war. It was also the breaking of the Sussex Pledge in the process. The second thing that then added on to the Lusitania led the U.S. to declare war was the Zimmerman Note. The Zimmerman Note was a message from the German ambassador from Germany, but it was the German ambassador to Mexico. And the White House intercepted a coded message. So White House, it's not like they gave it to us. They not only intercepted it, but figured out the code. So coded message. And what this message said was essentially they encouraged Mexico to invade the U.S. And it basically said, like, hey, you know how the U.S. took over some of your land in the past? Well, you know, just spitballing here, but if you were to happen to decide that you should take back and reclaim your land, your rightful land, we as Germans would support this. So basically, like, it was in trying to get Mexico to invade the U.S. so that we would, I guess, be focused with a war with Mexico and not get involved in Europe. It had the opposite effect because one, the Mexicans didn't invade the U.S., and two, we intercepted the message, so we knew what they said. So this led to war. These things led to a declaration of war. So now the U.S. went from neutrality to being in the war. And that's why then you had those issues with women continuing to push the anti-war protest, but now all of a sudden, because of the sentiment of either you're with us or against us, they began to be charged or threatened with job loss for continuing it once the war. So it's okay when you're in the war, or when you're not in the war, bad if you're in the war. But one of the things that had to happen was to convince Americans to support the war, like, because they had to go and do a 180, and this is why, like I said, the propaganda becomes very effective, and it's why you have over 20,000 women part of the WPP, and that's not counting women who protested or were against the war but weren't part of that group, who most of them switched over to actively supporting the war. And the reason that happened was because of an entire propaganda program that was created in order to convince Americans that the war was a good thing for the U.S., that it was necessary, that it was vital, and it should be supported. And what the government created, the CPI, and the CPI was the Committee on Public Information. And their whole job was to convince the American population of the necessity and benefit for war. You had over 150,000 people that were employed who worked for the CPI. And they began creating a massive propaganda campaign to everyday Americans. They're also going to work with the war labor effort, and when we talk about that in a minute, women working in the war industry, the CPI was involved with that as well, of promoting women in the war industry. You had over 100 million pieces of literature, 100 million, pieces of literature created by the CPI. This included posters, which is what we're going to look at, and was the most common. The propaganda posters was definitely the biggest thing they created. Newspaper articles and magazine articles as well, and ads. You had flyers, or pamphlets that were created. These little like folded pamphlet tracts that they would send out. And then the 4-Minute Men. The 4-Minute Men were men who would go stand on the street corner on like a soapbox and give 4-minute spiels about why the war was necessary, why it was important to support, and on all of that. So what we're going to look at are the themes on women in the propaganda posters and how women were portrayed in various ways. So I'll write them in a minute. Let's look at the posters first. Okay, so you have, there's several different types, and the first is recruitment, and some of these don't have women in them for that, and just to show the difference in how they used them, and a lot of them do in different ways as well. The recruitment to the military had the least amount of women being used, not surprisingly, because of course you have to look at, in each one of these propaganda posters, who are they trying to target? Well, they're trying to get men to join the military here. So these posters were for men. And so we're going to look at how women were portrayed in the ones when they were used versus just how they kind of use propaganda posters. So the United States Army builds men, right? And it's got character, craft, character, physique. So you have this idea of this emphasis on it, developing, going from a boy to a man. That you also have guilt as a big thing, right? I'm doing my duty, are you? So you're supposed to feel guilt for not being, doing your part. Here we go. Honor, uphold our honor, fight for us, join the Navy, Marines. So here we have women, right, And in this one, the women were often shown as liberty or America. Just a second. All right, sorry about that. Had to pause it for just a second. So liberty is usually, women are usually shown as liberty or America, and then of course just the feminine aspect of, with dress, the stance, of course, then the idea of honor as well. It's up to you to protect the nation's honor. So again, we should probably put with the other one, right? Women as honor as well. Here, though, this is the start of it. It's not the only one. We're going to see some more explicit examples, but women as victims. And she's not fully a victim here in this one, but looking down, head down, kind of hunched over, as if, that something has happened to her, or honor has been abused, and that the men's job is to protect. That would be another part of it, right? That's connected with victims, is that men need to protect women. Now this one, I guess I probably don't need to write women for each one, since that's what I'm emphasizing here, but that's okay. I started it. I will just keep going with it. Gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy. So this one is meant to essentially emasculate men, and the idea of, look, this girl would join the Navy if she was a man. And if she's willing to join the Navy, why haven't you? So you also have this one of this kind of, but at the same time, right, she's meant to look cute and enticing. So you have both this weird kind of mix of, we'll say, seduction, right? It's not full on here. Emasculation as well, to a degree, or the idea of making the men feel guilty. Right? Not the same guilt as, oh, these people are dying because you aren't doing your duty. But that idea of like, oh, she's cute and pretty, and look at her, and how she's, being a little flirty. All right, so seduction or flirty. Right? And then the emasculation. And then you have, here, this one again is a victim. Destroy this mad brute. Enlist. So the helmet is always to represent Germany. This is the type of helmet they had. So anytime if you see one, even though obviously it's not a person, one of the things that they also do with Germany is that they represent them as non-human. But if they've got the helmet, then that's Germany. They also use the word Hun, and it was meant to be a slur and derogatory, as though they were barbaric. That was the derogatory part of it, is the Huns, that the Germans were Huns, which was a group that they claimed, were earlier barbarians, if you will. But here you have the woman that she's being carried off by Germany. And not only, like, they got culture with K, and he's stepping on, and it's bloodied, and stepping on, it's very hard to see here, but America. But that she's the victim, and it usually is connected to what seems to be sexual assault. If you can see, like, her top is pulled down. She's got her hands on her head, and that would be the other part, distress. Right? So again, you have this idea of men needing to protect and save women. Okay, the next one. First call. I need you in the Navy this minute. Our country will always be proudest of those who answer the call, the first call. This is just the guilt trip, right, for men. This one doesn't have women in it, but I wanted to showcase a variety of the propaganda posters that they used. This one I put in because it's too funny to me to not put in a wonderful opportunity for you. And then it shows him like going like he's on vacation, right? And then really small down here, ashore on leave. So we're not going to talk about the fighting and the horrors of trench warfare that you're going to get thrown into. We're going to make it look like it's a fun travel adventure. And then really in small print say what it is, this only happened, the wonderful adventure for you, and this excitement is happening only when you're ashore on leave, not when you're actually fighting. So here's the other one, right, of that seduction. I want you for the Navy. That's, straightforward of that for enticing men through women. Now we move to, so those were all the enlistment ones. Then we move to Liberty bonds, right? So this was money, raising money. Here you have this woman kind of in front of the soldiers. So one of the things, I won't keep putting women. One of the things that you have with this is that it's the idea of involvement in the war, right? So you can't go fight, but it's like you're with the soldiers because you're buying bonds. So buying bonds is like how you are part of the war, right? They're fighting, we're all doing our part in different ways. But holding one of the things that's interesting with this, right, is that we talked about victims or in distress, but here this one is proud, right? She's shown as being proud and that kind of the pose to one holding up the American flag, but also that pose, but also still feminine. And then most of them fit into the feminine component of it. But you have this proud stance, which is very different. And so one of the things, right, Liberty bonds, who's this to? Who's this targeting? Right? It's targeting both women and men, but women definitely more than men. It was to anyone on the home front that wasn't fighting, but it really was still targeted more towards women than men because they were the larger percentage of the population that was still at home, right? Which I think would go back real quick and look at, if we start, here, right? This is enlistment, since, enlisting, and they're targeting men. Okay, so that's important to pay attention to in each one of these categories. Who are they targeting, and what is it for? This one is guilt, right? And this is for this one's not guilt. This one is help. Sorry, then there's another one that's guilt. So in this one, it's that again that you are helping directly with the fighting and war. Right, because the idea is that by buy bonds, bullets. The idea, or bonds, sorry, buy bonds. Bonds buy bullets. Just I can read here. Bonds buy bullets. Right, so he's sitting here with his hand out to you to hand over more bullets, and the way that you're in the field fighting with him, handing him more bullets, is by buying bonds. Help crush the menace of the seas. Again, fighting against it. This is in reference to the U-boats, right? And it's this, again, how is it portraying Germany as only a bloody arm? They never show them as fully human. And so the idea is that you are, right, you're fighting the battle. You're helping defeating the enemy. Beat back the Hun with Liberty Bonds. So again, same thing, right? This one is definitely guilt all the way. This is a big guilt trip. His Liberty Bond paid in full. So it's a dead soldier, right? This boy has made the last great sacrifice. Are we as Americans doing our part? In buying Liberty Bonds, we can provide the money necessary to sustain and protect our other boys who must take his place in the trenches. Let's do our duty and do it quickly. Help Uncle Sam stamp out the Kaiser. So here's another one. Buy Liberty Bonds. Halt the Hun. This one is again, the idea of putting you in, helping with the war, with the fight. But then what we see with the woman that's portrayed, with a woman and child, is again, she's the victim. She's distressed. And you now have a child that's added to it as well. And what kind of looks like that they're naked. So that would suggest that sexual assault again. This connection to like violence against women. And that this can be stopped by you buying Liberty Bonds. But then I guess see how it shows the American soldier. They've got the gun and he's there with his sword, which they didn't fight with swords very often in the war. And then he's just putting his hand over him. I mean, it's completely impractical for not getting yourself stabbed when you do it. But it's meant to be this proud, like, halt, I will stop you kind of thing. This one I put in because this is important about something we're going to talk about in a minute. Are you 100% American? Prove it. This is a threat. One of the things is that there's going to be massive anti-immigrant sentiment, specifically with German immigrants, but it's going to be for all immigrants, but Germans are going to be targeted the most. And there were stuff that talked about how children and women should pay attention in their neighborhood and turn in their neighbors if they think they're suspicious as aiding the enemy. This, buy Liberty Bonds to prove that you are 100% American, right? Otherwise, you're not. So this one is super important because this was a direct threat to all men and women who were immigrants. We don't think you're a real American. Prove it. Prove it by buying Liberty Bonds. So you can show that if you're questioned of how American you are, you can say you bought Liberty Bonds. So this one, they're just outright threatening men and women that are immigrants or families were immigrants. It doesn't have to be direct immigrants. It could be that your parents were immigrants. Sometimes even your grandparents were immigrants. Those people were targeted. Those women were targeted. And so this was just a direct threat. Okay, this one is now we talked about victims. We talked a little bit about honor and liberty. But then this one is a hero, right? They're comparing her to Joan of Arc, who also, right, this idea of strong and a fighter. This is definitely targeted just to women. The other ones, some of them were to men and women. This one is very much, it even says, right, women of America. Save your country by war. So what's interesting, right, is when you have differences of when the target is men versus men and women versus just for women, and how women are portrayed depending on which one of these that the target is. And we see the ones that are directly targeted just to women tend to almost always have strong female figures, and it's a positive image versus the distressed and in need of protection and a victim. Food is ammunition. Don't waste it. Oh, now you have the Liberty Gardens. Now we'll look at this with there wasn't like official rationing. It was all on a volunteer basis. So they did a ton of propaganda. These were definitely targeted towards women because women were the ones that were going to be responsible for the Liberty Gardens and canning. It wasn't going to be the men that were doing this. So all of these ones were really targeted towards women. This one, again, is kind of you have these figures in the background that actually looks more like the Revolutionary War than World War I, and they do that a couple of times too, is that they connect it back to the Revolutionary War, right? And your part that way. So by having not wasting it and also having your own Liberty Gardens, right? You are fighting in the war. So this is how women can play a role directly in the war. The fruits of victory. Write for your free book to National War Garden Commission. So this idea of like, right, again, it's this proud, patriotic, and then her stance, right, of kind of being looking forward, looking proud. It's meant to kind of represent the all of those type of poses where it's America and liberty. And usually you have the flag where these women are dressed in the flag. But this is here canning, right? You're canning for victory. Here is another one. Sow the seeds of victory. Plant and raise your own vegetables. So again, that pose, the pose for women is the pose or stance is always important. It's meant to create that proud look, strong, right, that dignified, and then the idea of the American flag. The funny thing with this one, right, is the whole idea is don't waste food. She is totally wasting the seed here. That is not how you plant. If you just are tossing seed wherever, you are wasting so much seed. So they were going more for the symbol and of the stance than like the actual practicality of looking at that and going, aren't we supposed to like not waste food? Because this is totally wasting seed here. Again, this one's pleading to be patriotic. This one could be both to men and women. Because it's using that kind of pleading, begging tone of this woman, with her arms reaching out to you for help. So this one definitely has that more that a woman needs your help. And so we again see the difference when it goes to both men and women versus women. This one for women, same thing, right? Strong. A warrior, she's holding a sword. And this one, she's a protector. Women were largely the ones that worked on foreign campaign and sent relief to other places in the Near East and Europe. And so this definitely was targeted just directly at women. For you, they are giving their lives over there. For them, you must give. So for you, they are giving their lives over there. For them, you must give every cent you can spare. This is a guilt trip. So this is a unique one because this is a woman showing that. This was largely targeting women and the idea of, right, that they're guilt tripping here for that one. And we see that with men and stuff, but this is one of the rare ones where you have where the women are being guilt tripped into that. Hold up your end. So again, helping out right here. If you can't be a nurse, you can still raise money. You can still participate. But showing the here, right, not only a nurse and uniform, but a working woman. This is definitely targeted towards women with the idea that they would be a nurse helping on the other side. But if you can't, then buy Liberty bonds or plant Liberty Gardens. The greatest mother in the world. So this one's interesting, right? Because now in this one you have motherhood. And you could suggest that other one that was the guilt trip was a mother that was mourning a lost son. But this is also has religious undertones. So this is for the Red Cross, and so it's advertising for women, and specifically women in the Red Cross. But what you have here, this is a soldier, but this is meant to look like Jesus and Mary. That's why that size difference is off, right? Because it's supposed to be, it's from a painting of Mary holding Jesus. Civilization versus barbarianism. Why I put this in is because ultimately, the main argument of why the World War I was fought was to protect civilization. And I have a medal from it was my great grandfathers who fought in World War I, and this medal was given to all soldiers who fought in World War I, and it literally says on the medal, the war for civilization. This is how World War I got termed in justification. World War II is easier because we were attacked. World War I, they had to figure out some way to justify the war. And so what's interesting about this, though, is that all sides ended up creating this idea. So the Germans did it, the British did it. Every side claimed that they were fighting to preserve civilization against barbarianism. So interesting that like everyone took this as the argument for why they were fighting. So here you see it in a propaganda poster where they're just outright saying, right, we're fighting a war for civilization against barbarianism. And then this one, again, Revolutionary War, that's supposed to be Paul Revere, but as a woman, right? I mean, it's hearkening to Paul Revere, like where Paul Revere, you know, the British are coming, warning, wake up America Day. But it's a woman, and this is definitely targeting women, you know, sounding the warning alarm, waking America up to the war and America's participation in it. Okay, so let's look at the themes then on women. So the importance of course, that if you're who the target of the poster. So if it is for men, right, then women tended to, more often than not, you either had the seducer, or you had, or we'll just put the sexualization, right, flirt, seduction, that type of thing. You have the victim in need of saving. Which is connected to this sexual assault, which I think is interesting, that tended to be the emphasis on that. And then you do have a few women that are shown as liberty and America. And in all of these, there is a feminine aspect to it. Okay, and then at the home front, you have, and most of the time for men, this was for enlisting, right? And then men and women with the Liberty bonds. You have a combination, right? If we go back for just a second and look at this, you have a combination of guilt trip, participation in the war, women as victims, or strong, right? So let's separate it out as far as, well, yeah, we can do that. We'll just put all of them and stuff. But again, it still matters whether it's to both or whether it's to women, but we'll specify out some with women. So, your way of, participation in the war, how you can be a part of the war. You have this aspect of the guilt trip. You have women as victims. You also have some as more dignified, we'll say the feminine aspect as well. I think the key with this is that, right, again, it depends. You do have the proud, we'll say the proud, we'll say and strong. But the strong tended to be more for women. The proud, though, you have that feminine. I'm going to put that one too. So when it's specifically targeting women, we have women as warriors and fighters, and like Joan of Arc, or with a woman with a sword, that they're the protectors. They're strong, dignified. There still is some feminine, but less than others when men are targeted. So the idea and the point with this, right, is that the women were used to specifically showcase a specific message. And when they were targeting men, you had much more of that victim in need of saving violence attached to it against women, versus you don't really have the same violence against women when it's for both, and then not at all for women when it's just targeting women. And then there's a significant shift in women being strong protectors, fighters, and proud when it's only targeting women. So it's interesting, I just think, how they used women in propaganda posters to promote either enlisting, buying Liberty bonds, doing the Liberty Gardens, or with the nursing and support that way. And that they through a lot of them, there's some connection to women in that. And then obviously we had some that didn't have women, and they still use some of those tactics, but it was a lot more like when the ones that women weren't there, of just being a part of it, participating, right? How you're going to help fight the enemy. When women were not included, it was showcasing you're going to help fight the enemy. But when they were, then there's that added component to it to evoke emotion, and that's really what part of this was an attempt to evoke emotion that would get people to support, either enlist or buy Liberty bonds. The thing with this type of propaganda is it's actually going to lead to modern day advertising. Previously, advertising was just about here's what we have, right? There was an expectation that you either needed it or you didn't, so we're going to describe what we have. World War I with the CPI uses psychology to advertise, to promote the propaganda. And what you're going to get from that is in the 1920s and in the 1950s and modern day advertising uses psychology to evoke emotional responses to get people to buy things. So we're going to look at the women in 1920s advertisements and see how there were changes. The other changes that took place were that they were full color. There's not a lot of writing on it. Earlier advertisements had tons of writing. Instead, it's slogans, catchy phrases, and full color pictures. And that is going to be the new mode of advertising as well. So the CPI, one of the larger significance, besides, of course, using women in certain ways to evoke emotional responses, was that it became the early construct for modern day advertising. And we'll see that, I think, more clearly when we look at women in the 1920s ads and then women in the 1950s and advertisements there. Okay, so now what we're going to look at is the the World War I and participating in the war, or we'll say war efforts, because it wasn't fighting so much. So here, let's do women and the war effort. You had several different ways that women helped. One of a big organization that was created was also a super long name. They liked long names. The Committee of the Council of National Defense. And this was created by Anna Howard Shaw. And certainly followed what we saw with the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, of creating a massive organization, right? And it was an organization to bring together the millions of women that wanted to help out in the war. Helping, let's say, with the war effort. And it was meant to match women with specific needs. And so this was, whether it was fundraising, nursing, jobs, etc., it was all meant to help women serve. One of the things that's interesting that keeps coming up was this fear of women becoming losing their femininity, and especially because some of the jobs that we'll see with the home front, or even being connected to the Army for the first time officially. They weren't official military, but they were officially connected to the military, and they had different specialized uniforms for the women. Is that there was this fear of being masculinized, the loss of femininity, and that women would become too male-like. And so she had to specifically assure women and men, but even women, that women would not lose this. So even, when this was a variety of things, this wasn't just fighting in the war. And the CPI helps with this and promoting this as well. One of the other areas was the Red Cross, which was provided a lot of different areas and was largely based on women. You had over 8 million volunteers. And they did a ton of different jobs. They made surgical masks, because those had to be handmade essentially back then. Also surgical dressings, bandages, things like that. Gowns to be the surgical too. They also volunteered at the hospital to help with those that were injured. They were nurses with the Red Cross, and they also were part of the motor service, which was where women transported men to the soldiers to hospitals or camps. And this was both overseas. Actually, most of this was overseas. There was some locally. They did have the local Red Cross at home, but a lot of these women went overseas to be able to do these things. And then you also had American librarians, which were largely women as well. By this point, that had become a female job. Sent books and magazines to soldiers. And while overseas, some of them went overseas to the war front, and they set up 36 camp libraries, right, military camps. And they just, they distributed over 10 million books. And they also raised some money. They raised $5 million in funds. So this was important just for, war is stressful. It was not an easy thing, and one of the things was with trench warfare, it was often long periods of boredom, and so being able to have something that you could read in your downtime was psychologically super important. So this seems kind of random, but it really actually was an important service to provide the men something to do in the trenches, to get their mind off of just the horrors of the situation. Trench warfare was really bloody and psychologically really distressful. They had what was called shell shock, which was basically PTSD, and a good majority of the men who were in the trenches for any length of time had a various level of shell shock because of the brutality, because of the constant kind of waiting for attacks to happen in between the shellings of the trenches. Because of you're stuck in getting trench foot and potentially gangrene from standing in water. They had rats the size of cats in the trenches. And then the worst part was no man's land. So you went over the top of the trench, where then you were met with machine gun fire a lot of the time. And you had to just keep pushing forward to try to get to the other trench, which often didn't happen. But men that got injured and fell in no man's land, which was a land between the two trenches. Essentially, you had trenches on either side. And here, we'll just kind of randomly in it, but trench warfare. Basically, what you had is if you had a trench, right, and there'd be barbed wire, and then you'd have another trench. So the two were there, and they were obviously often really close. Like you could yell, and hear the other army. So this was no man's land, and it often had massive holes in it from shells. And then what would happen is that you would go over the top, you would charge the other trench, but they'd be just sitting in here shooting at you as you charged. Well, if you fell in no man's land after they had retreated, no one could go pick you up, because if anyone went over, even medics, if they went up and poked your head up over the trench, you were sniped, you were shot at. And so the men had to listen to the friends and other soldiers dying in no man's land, and they were still alive, and listening to them cry out in pain, beg to be saved, and there was nothing they could do. So you had, like I said, the shell shock and psychological aspect of it, the fact that it was standing water and large rats. They say rats the size of cats. The smell and dead bodies. You couldn't pick up the dead bodies in no man's land, but there would be often the trenches where the people who died would be piled off to the side. And then you had to deal with lice and trench foot. Everyone just shaved their head because of lice. And then just getting shelled every day before an attack, and then gas warfare. And so it was just brutal. So, right, why that this was important to that was because it provided some kind of mental relief from that. Women also worked as telephone operators. And these were seen as vital to keeping the military, the communication with the military. So they were called switchboard operators, actually, but it was for the telephone. They basically worked directly for the Army Signal Corps. You had they took the same allegiance of oath that soldiers did. And they had a uniform. It was a special uniform for women, but they did. And then you had over 233 women worked overseas, right where the battles were happening. And again, were seen as an extension of the Army, but did not receive veterans pay because they weren't officially in the military, right? They were an extension of the Army. World War II will be the first where women are officially part of the Army, where you get veterans pay, where you're not a separate women's branch that is part of that. So you had women as nurses, you had women as telephone operators, you had women as transporters of ambulances and just regular transportation to camps. You had women that set up libraries in the camps. And so all of these different ways women were involved with the war effort. Now we're going to look at the home front and some of the things that were going on there. So there were two big things with that. The first was the war industry. The war industry, it was like factory work for producing various things that were needed for the war. They needed women to work in these jobs because the men were at war. So there was a significant shortage of workers because all of the men were being drafted into the war. The thing with this is that these were then traditionally defined as male jobs, which is what made them unique. They were jobs that during peacetime were ones that wouldn't hire women. So one of the things that was significant about this, and because of the need, is it allowed a lot of women to switch jobs to higher paying jobs. higher paying jobs, because the war industry jobs paid better than jobs that were traditionally for women. It also increased the number of women working for the first time. Around 1 million women were new to working outside of the home. So that's not the total number of women working, just the number of women that had not worked outside of the home before. Around 2.4 million women worked in war industry jobs. So this also doesn't count jobs that other types of the jobs that women were doing, just the war industry. So the types of jobs that women did within war industry work were in munition plants, working on as train engineers, drill press operators, also streetcar conductors, and mail carriers. Again, these were all male-based jobs before that. Let's see. The CPI was significant here because they promoted this type of work in order to get women into the field, because there was some resistance, because it was, for so long had been pushes that these were jobs for men. Women were not allowed to do these types of jobs. This wasn't, womanly, if you will. And so the CPI did a lot of work in promoting this, and how they promoted it was that it was patriotic, right? You were doing your civic duty and being an American working for this. The other thing that the CPI did is, again, there was that fear of loss of femininity. And so the CPI essentially advertised it. They had to sell it, right, as an extension of female labor. Besides, the other part was, of course, that it was patriotic, and so that made it acceptable for a time period. But how they advertised it as an extension of female labor was sewing parachutes was just like sewing at home, right? So hey, you sew at home. Well, sewing parachutes in a factory is just the same thing. Working in a munitions plant was just like this one was a little bit more of a stretch, using kitchen supplies or tools, right, at home. Again, that one was a bit more of a stretch, but they had all these advertisements where that's what they did, like, no, don't worry, it's okay. You sew at home, you can sew parachutes. It's the same thing. Oh, you're building munitions for war. Oh, that, you use kitchen appliances. Same thing. And so that's what they did with that. How believable some of that, but that was how they justified it in that sense. And then they also made sure to show women in propaganda posters that were working in the factories as feminine. So again, that was targeting that idea of that fear, which it doesn't go away. It's going to be the same thing in World War II, that there's going to be this huge discussion of femininity. So working in factories as feminine. So because there's this irrational fear of that, like, oh, if women work in these munition plants or in the war industry, then they won't want to be mothers, they won't be wives. I mean, it's completely irrational argument. And yet not only was that disproven in World War I, but comes back around in World War II as the same exact problem. So again, it really shows how critical in society throughout history this idea of connecting women to the domestic sphere is. And that when anything moves away from the domestic sphere, that it becomes then this big concern about, oh no, what is that going to mean for women? Oh no, women are not going to be connected to the domestic sphere, then they become masculine, and that's just a horrible option to have happen. And then there was a big emphasis on the work as temporary, right? That this was okay to step outside of normal bounds because women weren't going to be doing this forever. And the truth is that most women lost their jobs when the men came back from war, because they were not expected to stay in it. They were just working there while the men were gone. They were not allowed, and they weren't allowed to choose. It was definitely that you're fired. You were expected to quit, but if you didn't, you were let go because the war industry, right there, it was no longer needed. And then the next area that we're looking at was at home. And with this, you have, we'll say volunteer rationing. There was no official rationing. In World War II, there will be, but there was no like ration cards, no government restrictions. The rationing of World War I was all based on a volunteer basis, and so there was a huge emphasis in propaganda posters, like we saw at the Liberty Gardens, to promote this, and that was one of the ways of to get people to voluntarily ration, was to say, make your own, grow your own Liberty Gardens. Canning your own food was also promoted, and this was easy. This was definitely easier connection for the domestic sphere towards women. And that's where they use like the ideas of planting gardens can save lives, and then avoiding eating when possible meats, using sugar and wheat, because these things were needed for the soldiers. But again, this didn't need a lot, the same level of propaganda, because this was all very much part of what was traditionally seen as the domestic sphere, unlike the war industry. And so women were lauded within this, whereas the other had spent a lot of time, like with the war industry, it spent a lot of time convincing people that women weren't going to turn into men somehow. Don't worry, they will still be women when this is done. Versus this was like, oh yeah, this is traditionally what women do, so good for you. This is, you're following your role in that aspect. What's really interesting, that this also gets connected to being patriotic, and basically not being selfish. That people who didn't ration, that didn't self-regulate, they were selfish, they were unpatriotic, they were un-American. This word gets used a lot. Are you American or are you un-American? And so that you had this pressure to do this. It was social pressure and government pressure, right, through the CPI to ration, one of the things that there's an interesting argument with this, so there's this whole book on this of the idea of skinny women as the beauty standard, that this developed because skinny meant rationing, right? And rationing meant patriotic. There was not, and there wasn't, and you could argue against this, right? This is just, this is an argument, and I think it's a valid look at it. You could also argue against it, but so there's the whole book on talking about our relationship with food, and the book, it's really interesting. I'll see if I can find the title, and maybe I'll put it up just for anyone who's interested. The book talks about a relationship with food with a transition to industrialization, and how our relationship to food changes from when we were farmers and family farms, and how food was used then, to industrialization and urbanization, and with that the removal of that direct connection to where the food comes from in the land and producing it yourself. And more importantly, also with urbanization, the fact that you don't, like, they didn't have, like, the whole FDA and food regulation comes about because of industrialization, and the fact that butchers would put red flakes on meat to make it look redder, like that it was not getting old, right? Because meat changes color as it gets older, but these red flakes were lead. And they didn't have regulations on, like, bread, and so bakers that were corrupt would put a plaster of Paris and sawdust and other things into the mix of flour to save money, and various things like that. And so having old food, not knowing if it was spoiled, where it came from, the quality of food definitely went down with industrialization. And so the book takes a look at from farming to industrialization to World War I, and then after. But what the author talks about in World War I is that there wasn't this idealized sense of women as skinny, as a form of beauty before World War I. But after World War I, this began to develop. And what is argued is that the reason that transition to that view of skinny as beautiful was because during World War I, if you were rationing and not gorging yourself on food, right, then you were likely to be skinnier. Someone who was overweight, what the assumption, it's not necessarily true, of course, but the assumption in society was that people who were larger were not rationing. People who were skinnier were rationing. Therefore, this sense of patriotism and positive association got attached to women who were skinny. Whether or not they were rationing, that was what then was formed in the consciousness of society. And then that this kind of stuck within society of the idealized version of beauty. Because if you go back to, like, hunting and gathering and early societies, larger was actually seen as more beautiful, because there was a connection to not having enough, and people who were larger showed that they had enough food, and so that also was equated with wealth often as well. So you have this different view of weight and food that gets connected to it over time in history. It's an interesting argument. But there definitely was this association with food and patriotism. Whether or not you buy into the skinny component of it, there very much was a connection between food and patriotism for women. Men were not included in this. Surprise, surprise. It was only directed at women. And not just the skinny part, just the idea of positive association with food, and rationing and what you did, and your patriotism. Even if men weren't soldiers, that didn't get tacked onto them, because not surprisingly, canning, gardens, things like that were very much part of that domestic sphere. So it's not surprising then that women are the ones that get all of that attachment and men don't, because that wasn't their domain in the eyes of society. The other one which we talked about was Liberty bonds, right, which was a form of government fundraising. The government would issue Liberty bonds, and then people would buy them, and that money then would go to the government to be able to spend on the war effort. And then the idea was after the war was won, you got that money back plus interest. They were pretty secure investment. It was just about fronting the money because the U.S. had a pretty good record at this point of winning wars. The time when they were most of a gamble was the Revolutionary War, which is why the whole IOU with the soldiers was such an issue. But if you look at the bonds and stuff, and obviously it was an issue for the Confederacy, those bonds, they got nothing. There is a great example of how bonds are a risk is the Confederate States. They issued the bonds, the war bonds, and we looked at those tickets that showed them. Well, everyone that bought Confederate war bonds got nothing for their money because the Confederate States collapsed, and therefore there was no government to reissue that. But if you're looking at with like United States wars, when they sell them in World War I and World War II, it was a pretty solid investment. And there wasn't really a period of time where it was like the U.S. might lose this war kind of thing, especially because we come in later to both of these wars. So it was an easy way for the government to raise funds for the war effort and for people to show their support and also invest. Obviously, you had to have some money to do it, though. Bonds were strongly pushed by the CPI, right? The CPI was involved in all of these areas, but it was specifically women were targeted for bonds, in part because they were the ones that were most likely to be home in posters and propaganda. With so many men being drafted, and when you're targeting at the home front, it makes sense that women would largely be targeted for that. Women, for their part, raised funds, so they had fundraisers and to buy Liberty bonds in larger amounts. And they also did, how they raised the funds for this was public marches and letters, writing letters, and they did have some organized relief funds gatherings. Right, so kind of like the fairs or buying tickets and things like that. So throughout all of these wars, right, we've seen women have played a role in fundraising for the war effort, being a part of that, seeing that as important in that nature. And then the last thing we're going to look at is just immigration. So one of the things was, as I mentioned, this anti-immigrant sentiment. And also not only that, but Americanization. The idea of that we need to Americanize recent immigrant families. And you had, they had what was called Trading with the Enemy Act. Which prohibited foreign written newspapers. So there was this huge discouragement. They discouraged families, and specifically mothers raising their children, to speak in their native language to their children, right? And so you had generations of kids that didn't end up learning the language of their parents because they were too afraid to teach it to them, because they wanted them to embrace American life as much as possible, because you had these threats coming, like the propaganda poster, are you 100% American? Prove it. You had thousands of immigrants and even first-generation American citizens arrested for being subversive. There was a huge push to teach American values in the schools, which of course women, then the women teachers, were responsible for. The idea of language, of culture, of dress, and they told the teachers, I mean, right, women teachers had to be patriotic, they had to support the war, and so it was meant to create the school teachers that were all women from the elementary school. Their goal was to create patriotic Americans. And so with that, you had, or unhyphenated Americans is what they called it. No foreign languages in schools. Like kids were not supposed to speak other languages in school. All the while they still used those who spoke German and other languages as interpreters in the Army. There was an emphasis on focusing on American culture and suppressing other foreign cultures and dress, food, just trying to create this sense of focus on Americanization. They also changed German names in everyday things. Well, I'll just tell you that one in a minute. One of the other things with this that was important with this is just this sense of the mother's responsibility to protect their kids. And so then it felt like there was an obligation to deny your culture so kids would be seen as American. But then also the difficulty of this, of having to deny that culture in that process, right? And like I said, neighbors, women, the CPI targeted women for this too, and said, if you see anything strange, if you see any neighbors that seem suspicious, report them. And so you had women spying on women, you had families that were afraid that they would be accused falsely of being spies. And this kind of hysteria got so much, they changed German names on things like streets. Hamburgers got called Liberty Burgers for a while. They banned any literature and music made by German composers. And then you just had these crazy stories in the newspaper about how German soldiers used the dead bodies, or Germans used the dead bodies of their soldiers to make soap, which wasn't true. And so it just created this massive anti-immigrant stance and position in America, where not only did women have to promote it and teach it as teachers, but the women who were immigrants had to try to promote it to their children for fear of their children being, something negative happening to their family. But also then the fear of not being seen as American, even if you were not an immigrant, but an actual American citizen, but who had parents were immigrants. And they might be American citizens too, but it doesn't matter because you're seen as being a hyphenated American, someone whose loyalties are divided. And so then women had to, within this subset of group, had to go far to prove their loyalty in the process. So you had this positive aspect of how women, worked and supported the war effort, but then you have this negative aspect of World War I that really was negative, with the this constant fear of subversive activity, whether it was punishing women who were anti-war protesters after the U.S. got involved in war, or punished women who came from immigrant families. And many women were arrested between these two groups because it didn't fit this cookie cutter idea of fully American, supporting America, especially with the term patriotic. And I think that's the key to it, right? Is that you had this term patriotic used as a weapon against women. It was used to praise women, and it was used to attack women. And so you have at the home front like this dueling identity between those kind of ideas and then the patriotic war industry work and volunteer work of women showing their support for the war effort and what they felt was either a forced or importance. Most of it felt as an importance to get involved, but definitely within immigrant families, women would have had a much more forced feeling of getting involved, or there were, significantly negative consequences. But even again, a forced, even if they didn't address it, the fact that you saw women getting arrested for continuing to protest the war, not the U.S., but just that that war is bad, just to say war is bad could get you in trouble, puts a kind of forced component on it for these war activities. And now most, weren't thinking of that in their head and did move to generally support the war, in large part because of the efforts of the CPI, that still was an undertone that was there. And while it was targeted at both men and women tended to feel more the brunt of this, because they were the ones that were more likely to continue not feeling support for the war or feeling responsible for raising their family and the consequences of that. And the fact that they were the ones that made up a huge percentage of the home front. So you have a forced sense of patriotism that if I'm on the home front and I'm not being drafted into war, I have an obligation to do these things, which can be both a positive obligation or one that's a required obligation that you have no other choice. And both of those things were valid and true during World War I. One of the benefits for women of World War I is that while most lost their jobs to the men coming back in the war industry, more women remained in the workforce after World War I than before. And we'll see that another jump in women in the labor force after World War II. The other thing that is important with this is it showed that that women could move beyond the domestic sphere to work. Still not there where it's acceptable in normal times, but it was a first transition to saying that it was acceptable for women to work outside of these conditions. Okay, we're going to look at the 1920s in the next lecture.